Thank you, everyone. I thought we'd get started. It is a school night. Mind you, we are in public holidays, but nonetheless, I'm so excited to have so many of you here for a very important forum of an issue that impacts us all. I would like to start by paying my respects to traditional elders of the land on which we meet and acknowledge their custodianship and care of country, and a country that we all hold very dear and very much appreciate. So thank you for being here for this housing forum. We have a lot of expertise in the room. Of course, I know a lot of community members feel like experts, but sometimes it's really good to bring stakeholders and organisations and those that really have to make decisions daily in this area. We know we're all committed to addressing housing challenges. We know they're urgent in Warringah and in Australia as a whole, and no community, no demographic is exempt from this problem. So I did want to start by setting the scene, because obviously sometimes media can set a certain perception, or we have the anecdotal experience of, you know, what's happening in our streets. But it's important to maybe understand just where we're at and where the crisis is at. So in Warringah, to understand also, you know, what's our makeup? Are we all house owners, renters? What's the situation? So in Warringah, there are 34.9% of residents who rent, which is higher. The national average is 31%. We have 30% of the population who have mortgages, and of course we're seeing the strain of that at the moment with the high interest rates and inflation, and also the high housing costs of our area and the stress that puts on the community. We know the median house prices are surpassing $2 million now, and the median apartment rents are now at $625 per week in Warringah. Now, keeping in mind, Warringah is a fairly diverse electorate, and we go from DY and the forest suburbs all the way to Neutral Bay Cremorne, and soon to be, Warringah will also take in all of the North Sydney CBD, which is a whole nother really demographic again. But we do have parts of Neutral Bay and sort of the fringe of North Sydney. Now, we know renters face a significant number of challenges. In Warringah, vacancy rates are incredibly low, less than 1% vacancy. So that means very difficult, a lot of people queuing, a lot of competition for spots. And we know as a result that is driving up renting prices. We know 33% of renters are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And that just does really highlight the next level of the problem, which is having affordable housing, but having a bit more security and secure affordable housing. So what we need to also take into account that when one sector faces a challenge, it has a ripple effect across all others. So, for example, when people are unable to enter the housing market because prices are so high and it is so competitive, what it means is they're forced to rent for longer, which means that rental market becomes more and more competitive and is tighter. And that increases demand, drives prices up, and makes it harder for those renting to then save for that deposit to try and get into the housing market. So what we do have is cascading consequences. And it's an obvious cycle, making it and very difficult to break. So when we discuss the pressing issues, we need to consider the changing landscape as well of housing demand. So in Warringah, single-person households are now 26.5% of Warringah, and they are the fastest growing demographic. So it's a very different demand to what people might think is the situation in Warringah. Yet the population is ageing, and our future residents are expected to be 55 years and older. So that really gives you a picture of where the demand is and what's needed. Meanwhile, I think when we talk about availability, affordability and the supply tension, we need to also think about what is a wholesome and a full community, right? We need to think about all the services we need to be able to be delivered within our community. We know we have about 81,000 workers in Warringah, but we have just under 10% or 7,800 registered from that whole 81,000 that are essential workers. Now, that means nurses, midwives, teachers, police, aged care workers, disabled carers. They can't afford to live in our electorate. We have very few registered as living in our electorate that work in those areas. Now, we need to be able to house essential workers within our community, because if not, we won't have a healthy community, but also we will have real issues of shortages of supply and care when it comes to very essential areas. So I think that's part of this discussion is I hope everyone really agreeing where that need is and why that need is so important to have that healthy diversity within our community. And we also need to acknowledge social and affordable housing shortfall. So we have over 58,000 individuals in New South Wales currently on a waiting list, and 8,000 of those are in the Northern Beaches alone. So need is in every community and very much in Warringah as well. Now, we know, unfortunately, some sectors of the community are resistant to improving the supply of affordable and social housing. And while we tend to acknowledge the need for it, we need to take on board the community objection, and absolutely it's important for that feedback to be heard. But we also need to find that balance between objection to developments, but also acknowledging that need and why socially we need that diversity within our community. And to give you some examples, right, some real examples happening. Recently, there has been a 3-year delay in the planning approval for a project to build 40 affordable rental housing options for women over 55, many of whom facing financial hardship. Now, that's been delayed for 3 years due to objections. I don't dispute the community has that opportunity and right to raise concerns with projects and potential developments. But we also have to acknowledge the consequence of blocking that kind of housing and what that means to those that very much need it. And that kind of housing helps people rebuild their lives within the community, the local community. And we have to, I guess it's important to understand that collaboration is key to create equitable and sustainable housing solutions within our communities. We don't want those that fall on hard times, so often through relationship breakdown, injury, loss of work, to then have to lose their support network, their families and their community, because we as a community are not offering that social and affordable housing within our community. So I think it's really important. So today's forum, I don't pretend I have a magic wand to fix this. That would be very ambitious and naive. But for me, it's about exploring the solutions and to listen to the community and understand what levers we should be looking at to pull to help ease housing issues. So we'll be discussing the National Housing Accord. So how realistic is it? Does it have enough incentives in place? It aims to deliver 377,000 new homes across New South Wales by 2029, and it imposes local targets on Northern Beaches, Mossman and North Sydney, and I'll talk shortly about that. How realistic, and is that working? Does it need tweaking or changing? There has to be a focus on planning reforms and how can we balance the character of our community and our area with the need for diverse and affordable housing options. And that does mean including mid-rise developments, rezoning, exploring ways to unlock government land for housing. And I know with that comes great community concern around higher density development and what that might mean. So moving forward in this discussion, the balance that I hope we can find is between supply-side solutions like increasing housing targets and then the demand-side measures, which can include, often talked about and raised in questions, migration, short-term accommodation, the impact of that, rent security and how do we increase rights for renters, reforms to taxation policies, and there's always a lot of discussion around negative gearing, but capital gains, and I'm not talking, and let's put everyone at rest, it's not about capital gains on the family home, it is about the capital gains discount when it comes to investment properties, and we will talk to that a little bit more. And we know these remain politically sensitive, and there's, it becomes a little bit of a standoff, but yet we have to talk about all of this to be able to talk about long-term sustainability in housing. So I don't think it's healthy to blame one policy or one sector to point the finger at why we've come to this level of crisis. And I really am going to rely on the expertise of the panel to give a bit of insight on why we're here. But it is about genuine community engagement and the opportunity to tackle these challenges head on to make sure we are an inclusive community with affordable options, a place where all can thrive and needs are met, and that must include essential workers and young people to be able to stay in our area. So I'd like to thank everyone who submitted questions in advance. There were some clear we had over 100 questions, so I'm clearly not going to be able to read them all out. But we have grouped them into the topics in which they really sat, and they were broadly, we had immigration, foreign ownership, external elements impacting availability. We had rental affordability, security and supply. Efficiencies in use of current supply, such as tiny homes, granny flats, room letting, can more levers and more stock be released that way? And of course, tax policy reform, and which are the most effective levers to make a difference. So first, I would like to, I will also take you to the panellists, but I thought I should get a bit of a sense for the room, maybe for the panellists' benefit as well, of, if you're willing to give me a show of hands, who owns their home outright or with a mortgage tonight? Okay, I think that's a pretty big proportion of the room. Who is renting? Okay, we have a good representation of renters. And who amongst that cohort has been forced to move in the last 12 months due to, I guess, price pressures and changes? Okay, so we have a few people that's happening to as well. So it's good. We are not unique, sadly. These are problems that we're seeing across other electorates, but it is good to know that is very much the position for the room. So the panellists that we have tonight, Louise Kerr, on the far stage left, is the Director and Planning and Place for Northern Beaches Council. Louise joined Northern Beaches Council in 2019, bringing a wealth of local and government and experience to council. She's worked in executive leadership and town planning roles at large metropolitan councils, including City of Sydney and City of Parramatta. And in her role as Director of Planning and Place, Louise is leading the transformation of the sustainable development of the Northern Beaches and enabling long-term planning and delivery of diverse, affordable housing choices across the Northern Beaches. Then we have Maiy Azize. She is the Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia and a spokesperson for Everybody's Home. Maiy is the Deputy Director of the largest charitable network, Anglicare Australia, as well as a spokesperson for Everybody's Home. And that's a national campaign to end Australia's housing crisis. The campaign is made up of over 400 housing and welfare organisations and has 40,000 individual supporters across the country. She's also the author of several major studies, including Priced Out, looking at the rental crisis, Asking Those Who Know, looking at experiences of Australia's welfare system, and 5 Ideas Australia Needs Now, a book released recently. And finally, we have Matt Grudnoff, the Senior Economist at the Australian Institute. And he's published widely on a diverse range of subjects, including taxation, tax concessions, the federal budget, poverty and inequality, retirement incomes, free trade agreements, housing affordability, energy economics, and climate change. Prior to joining the Australian Institute, he worked at the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Department of Climate Change. So thank you to the panellists, and in particular Matt and Maiy, who have travelled up from Canberra to be here to share their experience and expertise. I would lastly, before we get into it, also like to thank John Malone, who is a volunteer of Team Zali, and he has done a huge amount of work in preparing for tonight. So I wanted to do a special shout out to him, but also thank you. And also to Hadley and Nicola and my extended team, because we have small resources, but we are incredibly assisted by an amazing team of volunteers. But there's a lot of passion. It's very much a local team, and these local issues, everyone cares very much about them. I'm also delighted to join, and you may not have appreciated, but on the front row here, we have got a VIP line, because I am going to ask get a bit of feedback as well, so that you can really feel that we've got all areas covered. We have Rebecca Pingstone, the CEO of Homes New South Wales, Michael Regan, the independent member for Wakehurst, so he will very much give us a state government perspective. Representatives from North Sydney, Mossman and Northern Beaches councils, and congratulations to Anne-Marie Kimber for being now the newly elected mayor, and all councillors for re-election. And also from Northern Beaches councils, we have Sue Hines and Candy Bingham and a number of other councillors, and I know I'll be in trouble if I start naming people. We have from North Sydney Council representatives as well, and then also from Northern Beaches Council, so I've covered that, and the Planning Institute of Australia, John Brockhoff, the Policy Director, Sue Weatherly, New South Wales President, and Tessa Faucheur, the New South Wales and ACT State Manager, and finally also from Sydney Alliance Northern Beaches, Kat Coughlin and Stafford Sanders, who I actually met recently about some solutions as well. Thank you so much for everyone to be able to attend. If you have any further questions, please, they will hang around for answering questions, but be mindful some have travel to do and they are volunteering their time. So I will go to questions now and addressing some of the over 100 questions that were sent in and that we've pulled into sort of categories. And if I could start with Matt, which is handy, we've got it here. So, well, actually all panellists, how big is the problem? How did we get here? It'd be really good, I think, and helpful to get your perspective on that. Matt.
Yeah, look, it's taken us 20 years and we've really stuffed the housing market up. We tried hard and we can be proud that we have succeeded. It's a combination of two things. So I'm an economist, I know, please don't hate me, and I'm an economist from Canberra, which is even worse. But basically, if you want to make housing more affordable, there are two things you can do. You can either decrease demand for something that will make it cheaper, or you can increase supply of something. And we have done badly on both those fronts. On both the supply front, the government has largely vacated the field around affordable housing in the past, over decades I'm talking. There have been planning restrictions that have made it harder and harder to build houses. But also on the demand side, we have, particularly over the last 10 years after the introduction of the capital gains tax discount, we've encouraged investors into the market, and so we've increased demand for housing. And now what we have are a lot of investors basically showing up to auctions and outbidding owner-occupiers, outbidding first home buyers, and that also is pushing up the price of housing. So yeah, that's basically the short
your view.
Okay, I'll take a slightly longer view. I'll start back in the era when Australia actually had pretty affordable housing, because we haven't always been in a housing crisis. What were the things that we were doing that were working? For many decades in Australia, as Matt alluded to, we had a government that took what you would think is a pretty simple and common sense approach to the housing crisis, which is the government built homes and then it rented them and sold them to people. Zali and I were chatting about this before the event. Right up until the early 80s, about 1 in 3 renters in Australia was renting from the government, and this is a really big part of why housing was affordable in Australia. All sorts of people used to be able to rent from the government. It wasn't something that was a narrow option for a small number of people. If you were a teacher or a public servant or a construction worker, many times you rented from the government for some period in your life. You were able to put money away. It's a part of why people were able to later afford to buy. What we saw starting in the early 80s was the federal government really step back from starting to provide housing itself, and all of the incentives and all of the policy levers really started to be geared towards the private sector, and especially sort of small-time investors, as as Matt said. So I think this story sort of starts in the early 80s, and it's part of global trends. So in the Second World War was when the social housing was really built in Australia during that era, and it's when lots of governments around the world started building social housing. And then in the 80s, when governments around the world started sort of turning their backs on social housing and looking towards the private sector to do that job, we were part of those global trends. So we didn't fall out of the coconut tree, but it's part of these global trends. But what we've seen in the past 40 years is the government used to spend about $164 per person providing housing, and it now spends less than half that, $60 per person, and a lot of that is basically money that's not really on social housing. It's money that's sort of money foregone, things like tax investments, money on things like Commonwealth rent assistance to help people stay in kind of private rental tenancies. I think we can look at that and say it's not really working. And when you look around the world at countries that have managed to tackle their housing crisis, either avoid it altogether or turn it around, it's countries where the government is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It might be by renting housing, it might be by selling housing, or it might be by supporting people into home ownership in some other way, but you see a much bigger role for government in the countries that are doing it well.
And I'll take it to a local level of what we see on the Northern Beaches at the moment. So we're seeing a loss of essential workers. So as Zali said, over the last 10 years, we've seen a constant loss of essential workers that you probably see from, not being able to get the labour and not being able to get people to come and help you. And that is a problem for the Northern Beaches. We can't build a strong, vibrant economy. We have a significant shortage of social and affordable housing. The planning work that we did in developing our local housing strategy a few years ago, we have a undersupply at present of 8,000 social and affordable housing. Our long-term strategy is to plan for an additional 1,800 over the next 20 years, but we know through the applications that we're receiving that will continue to grow, and so that's the real challenge for us as an organisation going forward and for the community. And I think what you touched on, Zali, in relation to the community's appreciation for the real issue is very important. We see that play out in the assessment of development applications, and that does make it challenging. And it is embarrassing that there's 3-year delays on really significant infrastructure through additional housing for, our essential workers.
Thank you. So, still working? Yeah. So you touched on that question, that undersupply of carers, nurses, police, bus drivers. And I think we would all appreciate, it was only in 2022 we had major transport, we still have major transport issues, don't get me wrong, but we had major issues at the buses, right? Undersupply, we didn't have enough drivers, and we had a number of routes being cancelled, services simply not turning up, and so that was a major issue. And now that major shortage of bus drivers was because we didn't have them living in the area and they couldn't fill those shifts. Another area I'm aware of, currently much of our police force, our local police officers, actually live on the Central Coast and have to commute to service the Northern Beaches Area Command. Now that's not ideal as a community. I don't think that would be what we're striving for. Again, we know aged care workers, we know they've approached my office where they're having to hotbed to be able to do their shifts and then commute back to where they're able to afford to live. Now, and the reality is that the feedback is they simply choose not to do jobs in our area because it's just not possible to also do it safely. The commute becomes dangerous. So I think we really have to be cognizant of that, of the importance of affordable housing for essential workers and that need of a healthy community. So Maiy, maybe from Anglicare's position, what's for everybody, I guess, that difference of and the importance of social and affordable housing and why it's needed in all communities?
It's needed for the reasons that you touched on in your really great introduction about why communities benefit from having all kinds of people be able to live in them. Being a community that actually can have an aged care worker live here. But actually, I mean, watching all of the people put their hands up at the start, the number of people who own their own home with a mortgage, I imagine many of you have children. We know that if the Bank of Mum and Dad was an actual lender in Australia, it would be the 6th biggest lender. And I know that there are many people who are really struggling. They may have done well out of the housing market themselves, or they may have been lucky enough to get in at the right time, but now they're looking around and seeing that their communities are just not affordable for their children, and they're having to turn around and spend a lot of money to support their children to live in the communities where they've grown up and be able to stay there. That's not a healthy community. And so having social housing is something that everybody should have the opportunity to benefit from. I think one of the difficulties that we have, and one of the reasons we see some of these objections, is because social housing has become something that's not an option for many Australians. It's a safety net for people at the absolute margins, and people can't really see how it benefits them to have social housing in their communities. Back when so many more people were able to benefit from social housing and had the option to live in it, they could see the impact that it had on their lives. They could see that, oh yeah, someone in my family, perhaps my children might go off, get a job in education, construction, something like that, benefit from the opportunity to live in some subsidised housing, and that helps them make their way in life. So that's why it's important.
Thank you. And I might go to Louise, from even a planning and from a local government point of view. What proportion do we need to look at when you're required in zoning for affordable housing? How do we get there? I mean, you're even just the numbers you mentioned before, there's a discrepancy between the wait list and what's sort of planned. Do you have the targets to be able to house essential workers? But also, I guess, that understanding what is affordable housing, definition of affordable changes dramatically, I think.
The answer will depend on which local government area you're in, unfortunately, and the state has a mixed view on what is appropriate. At Northern Beaches, we have a policy position, it's our affordable housing policy, where we require 10% of where properties are being changed in zones to provide that as affordable housing. In the Frenchs Forest precinct in the town centre, we actually are more ambitious than the 10%, are asking for 15%. What we've seen, however, over the last couple of years through the implementation, is that we are not getting the numbers that are required. So as an example, in Frenchs Forest, I think we have 26 affordable housing approvals or thereabouts, which will come to market in the next couple of years. But apart from that, and a site in Queenswood, there isn't the 1,800 additional that we are seeking to, or that we need to achieve over the next 20 years.
Okay, and so maybe I'll go to the Sydney Alliance. Can you get a microphone? Can we get a microphone, Sydney Alliance? Oh, have you got a microphone? Very good. Which I actually met with you recently to discuss that question around mandatory inclusionary zoning. To maybe explain to everyone a little bit about it and what would it look like?
Thanks. And there's people way more to talk about mandatory inclusionary zoning, but we talked about this yesterday, Zali, so thanks for the opportunity. Sydney Alliance represents faith groups, community groups and unions across Sydney, and so we meet with communities all across Sydney to talk about these issues. So the principle of mandatory inclusionary zoning means that on new developments, just as Louise has described, let's say you had a new development where 40 units were built, so maybe 4 to 6 of those would be mandatory to be set aside for affordable rentals for the types of people that we've been talking about, so that our community can stay diverse. And developers might say, oh, we can't afford that, we can't afford to give you 10% or 15% of our profit. But actually the state government has provided some really juicy incentives for developers where they can actually get a bonus of 20 to 30% on the floor space ratio or the height if they provide that 10 to 15% of affordable rentals within their development. So I don't really see how they can lose. So yeah, it's just on new developments, and obviously the local and state and federal governments have got some great ambitious targets for housing over the next 5 to 10 years. And so what we need to see is 10%, 15% of all those new builds being set aside for people who really need to live in the places where they work.
That's the lost opportunity that Northern Beaches Council saw in relation to the low and mid-rise housing reforms, which were recently announced. There is no provision for affordable housing to be levied for all of those, and that is a significant number of housing that will come online across the northern, well, Sydney, but particularly the Northern Beaches over the next couple of years. Northern Beaches Council is doing a body of work at the moment where we are looking and working with the Department of Planning to be able to introduce a regime, like you say, so that we can take advantage of the additional housing that will come live because of the low and mid-rise housing reforms.
And I should say I was planning to throw a little bit later. We also have Zoe Baker from North Sydney Council here as well. So we've got all LGAs of Warringah here that can probably speak to this. We can. I'll throw to you in a minute. Give you all a minute to think about that. But first, I'll go to Rebecca Pinkstone from Homes New South Wales. Now, Homes New South Wales has recently been allocated $6.6 billion to increase availability, planning and supply and improve the quality of existing public homes. So it's a positive step. It's a lot of money, but I think Rebecca is here to outline a little bit how this is going to be delivered, and I guess the challenges such as shortage of labour, skills and access to materials.
Thanks for having. You can hear me? Great. Thanks for having me. So the budget was a bit of a game changer in New South Wales, with $6.6 billion invested in social and affordable housing in the state. That's the largest ever investment in social and affordable housing. But I think you're right, Zali, it won't touch the size of the 57,000 people on the housing register. At the moment, we're planning with that money to deliver around 8,400 social homes and a further 21,000 affordable and market homes. And I have received some questions about why we're doing that. Well, we really do believe in housing diversity at Homes New South Wales and having mixed communities in all areas of our city and our regions. Yes, this is an issue here, but it's also an issue for many regional communities and even rural communities not being able to have affordable homes. In this community alone, there are 3,000 people on the housing register, so waiting for a social housing property, and 1,000 of those have a priority need. They're homeless, they're women and kids escaping domestic violence, they're older women who can no longer afford to live here. And that's not even touching the workforce issues that we've talked about today. So we're really excited about the money that we've had allocated towards us to develop new homes. In this area, community housing providers manage the majority of public housing in the area. Bridge Housing, Link Wentworth and also St George Community Housing. That's really positive, I think, for this community because we've had changes at the Commonwealth government level. The Housing Australia Future Fund, which will fund new homes directly working with community housing providers, and it enables them to work directly with us and be able to redevelop the sites that are already in community. But I will say that the construction industry and the shortages of skills and also materials remain an absolute issue. What we're doing in response to that is being really clear about a pipeline of development across New South Wales and working with developer and builder partners through a process to be able to provide surety to the industry that there is a government program that will be rolled out. That's the most important thing. There's also work underway at a state government level through a housing outcomes network to be able to look at how we think about things like skills shortages more broadly in our migration policy and working with the Commonwealth in that way. So these are really important initiatives, but I will say that we need more of all housing. So social and affordable housing funded by the state is really important, but we just need more private market supply, and we need to have that in areas like the Northern Beaches and like our areas that are well connected, that have great thriving communities and have the potential to have density done well. So for us, the reforms and the planning reforms are really important. We can have density done well. There's potential to do that, and we need to be using our funding to support that to happen in a way that brings communities with us, supports people who are in absolute need leaving homelessness, but also helps those key workers that keep our communities functioning and moving.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is a little bit out of sequence, but I am going to throw. So one area that is raised with me from local government as well, though, is that we have current properties that are social housing or affordable housing, and they do end up being sold by state government for private development. And that is an opportunity lost, because obviously it's at profit to the government's bottom line, because our land values are high. But what we end up seeing is more, I guess, top-end development out of those opportunities, and no fix to more supply when it comes to that affordable housing. So, and I think maybe it is state government. I can raise it at federal level, but ultimately it's state government that is seeing that is sort of doing that. And how can, I guess, councils stop that from happening, but also how do we really, I think the community needs to be aware of the danger when that happens.
Sorry. Thanks. Look, really quickly, that has happened in the past, and that was a previous government policy, and that has changed. I mean, I remember when the Manly Daily was daily, I remember being outraged that they were boasting, the previous government, that they'd sold this property for $1.2 million, a public housing in Narrowena, not far from where I live. And they were saying, we're going to build 2 houses out in Blacktown. I thought, great, so we lose one of our residents and they gain 2 out in Blacktown, which is not cool, because they have networks and their family, etc., are all here on the beaches. So I've been very proactive, and Rebecca's sick and tired of seeing me in her office, and as is Minister Jackson, saying we've got about 750 of these big old properties in Narrowena and DY, and I said, and why aren't they 3 or 4 townhouses? Why aren't some of them units, like 2 and 3 story units? And why can't it be a mixture of private, public and social? It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be mixed, and we're working very closely on that solution. We've dragged the staff out and gave them a tour in of the area. We got on foot, took them to get their housing staff out there and showed them all through there, and they were very took my senior staff with me, and Ishbel and I, and we're doing that hard work. But as Rebecca said, there's a priority across the thing. So we're actually, to the government's credit, they've changed that policy, and there's money there. It's up to us to get that priority now, and I know council will be supportive of it. I know Louise has been supportive. I know the new council, you will be supportive, won't you, councillors? I'm looking at you.
Well, and I might go to our local governments, because obviously this impacts local governments. So Louise is from a Northern Beaches awareness, but we do have Mossman Council, and I have North Sydney Council here, and it's good for us to understand that this is a problem across the whole electorate. Louise, did you want to talk about it from a Northern Beaches Council concern?
We're happy, as obviously Michael has said, to work with the community housing providers and the state government to deliver diverse housing across the Northern Beaches. We've made no secret in our housing strategy. We need to plan for an additional 12,000 new homes over the next 20 odd years, and it is a partnership with all levels of government. We have some levers that we can pull, but as does other sectors of government, and we're committed to solving this problem as best as we can. We are really responsive in terms of the I suppose, the approach to the targets that have been set in terms of what we are expected to achieve through the completions. 5,900 is what we've been allocated on the Northern Beaches. North Sydney and Mosman will have their own. So, yeah.
Well, she got here from Mosman Council. We do have departing Mayor Carolyn Corrigan, but still Councillor Michael Randall, Pip Friedrich, and Maiy, but also Craig Kovich, the Director of Environment and Planning. So maybe Craig, you can give us a bit of a perspective from Mosman Council's view.
Yes, certainly. So Mosman, I suppose, for context-wise, I think you've got to appreciate we're quite small compared to the rest. We don't have the sort of housing diversity, the employment industrial zones that the majority of other municipalities have. So when you're looking at Mosman, we do have some levers to pull, but those levers are very limited. So we don't have that much of social housing. We've got a few blocks on Spit Road. So the thing with Mosman is, we've done a fair bit of heavy lifting in the 80s and 60s to 80s. So what people don't appreciate, and you often see Mosman on the front page of the Daily Telegraph not doing their work, not doing the heavy lifting, but in the 60s to 70s, Mosman was predominantly pushing out units, and we've got about 65% medium to high density dwellings in Mosman, which is much higher than the state average. So when I hear the panel members talking about density done right, I mean, Mosman's done density right. So, and we're often then not seen as doing our job, but we have a small target. We are working towards that target. We think we will achieve that target. But again, you're talking about the sort of a boutique market where we'll often get applications where they're downsizing. So a developer will buy a bunch of 6 units. We'll get an application for 4 units to go in that position. So, and often we're seeing the market demand is dictating what the property is looking like in Mosman. So again, I mean, I'll just reiterate, it's difficult. I hear, Warringah, Northern Beaches, should I say? I'm a Warringah resident formerly. I think some of the bigger councils have got a lot more levers, and we struggle, but the councillors as a whole, we're actively looking to play our part. We're, looking to engage with government to do what we can. But again, it's difficult for Mosman when you're seeing units. And, again, I want to be pragmatic and reality check that Mosman doesn't have that market for the first home buyer. We're seeing, some very high-end properties being built. And our land area, 8 square metres, if you take out a lot of the, the trust, the army barracks, you're looking at 25% of that is not actually residential area. So we've got a very small stock. And it is a struggle. I'm not going to deny and walk away from that, but we've got to appreciate that, we are doing our part. We're willing to participate, but it's limited to what Mosman can do.
Thank you. And then finally, because Warringah, I've also got Zoe Baker here, which I don't know if she was warned that I was going to put her on the spot, but from North Sydney Council, and Marcello, I don't know if your Director of Planning is here. Fantastic. So whoever wants to take the lead to talk a bit about, obviously, North Sydney. We only have a limited part of, obviously, Neutral Bay area in current Warringah, but I will be, subject to the next election, in Warringah will be taking in a whole new CBD and area of North Sydney.
You will. So my name's Zoe Baker. I'm the Mayor of North Sydney and a councillor-elect. We're having our mayoral elections next Tuesday. And it will be a big learning curve for you, Zali, because you're going to be including Wollstonecraft, Waverton, Crow's Nest in the North Sydney CBD. As opposed to the Northern Beaches, North Sydney Council is 10.5 square kilometres. We are one of the 3 most dense local government areas in the state. We have, as a council for more than 40 years, have had an absolute commitment to delivery of affordable and social housing. Councils like ours have quite limited resources in order to do that. So North Sydney currently has 133 affordable housing units that we own and are managed by a number of community housing providers. The most recent use and last of our affordable housing contributions has gone to an upgrade of an existing site in Miller Street, Camaray, to go from 5 units to 12, and that's with with Link Wentworth. And we have prioritised that those additional units go to DV families.
So in terms of the levers that a council can do itself, and we also have a series of projects where we want to deliver both community facilities combined with affordable housing for our community. So the big challenge we have is how do we fund it? And that's the opportunity with Homes New South Wales and with the federal government funding, and we have actively prioritised affordable housing and the delivery of that in North Sydney as a council priority. But the bigger issue that we have, as Louise just said, Northern Beaches Council's new housing targets for construction of new dwellings within the next 5 years is 5,900 dwellings. That's the same for North Sydney local government area. So the Northern Beaches is 107 square kilometres, North Sydney is 10.5, and we're already planning for at least a 27% increase in our population. So the big challenge, I think, for us, and it is complex, is about the fragility of the construction sector, the fragility of finance for construction. So in terms of delivery of new housing by the private sector, that is a huge barrier. There are thousands of approved dwellings in North Sydney local government area that are being land banked because the market is not ready to produce them. The paradox of that is even if they were, it wouldn't change affordability because we've had a loss of more than 2,000 boarding house rooms in the North Sydney local government area over the last 25, 30 years. And we've also had a housing boom where we've delivered thousands of new units and we have the highest ever housing prices. So where we have the best will in the world as a council, and we do, we are putting significant resources that Marcelo could speak to into this as a priority for us. It really is reliant on state and federal action, and in terms of state action, that is about mandatory inclusionary zoning and a series of other levers. But the reliance only on the private supply is not going to deliver it for our community. There are some really good models though. So for example, over the metro at Crow's Nest, currently there's a planning proposal to convert what was to be a commercial hospitality building into residential. So that's a massive uplift for the developer. But as part of that, they worked with the Health Services Union and the Department of Health, and they're also proposing an 8-storey building with over 100 key worker affordable housing in perpetuity to serve Royal North Shore Hospital. So it's going to be a combination of councils, private sector and government working together, but the problem, as Maiy and others have said, is more than 40 years in the making, and the solution is not going to be overnight.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to have a lot of work with all three councils, I can tell. But I'd like to now touch on, we can definitely see the supply problem when it comes to the affordable and social. And then with the will of the councils, the increase in construction, but yet affordability is an issue. And we've touched on a little bit also that this is a generational equity issue for young people being able to get into the market. How, even being able to rent is difficult, and then having that opportunity to get into housing. And we've talked a little bit about, or Maiy talked a little bit, the bank of mum and dad, but I thought I would go to Maiy and Matt a little bit around the question of, for first homeowners, at the moment lingering in the rental market and struggling in the rental market, how do we get to that next stage of incentivising or being able to assist for get more into being renters into the housing market? There's a lot of talk around first homeowner schemes. Are they working? What are the key levers you see in your experience as being effective? And Matt, we might start with you.
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, most of the schemes, like first home buyer grants that are designed to get first home buyers into the housing market, just make housing less affordable. They just push up housing prices. If you give all the first home buyers $7,000 or $14,000 or whatever it is, they'll all show up to the auction with the extra money in their pocket, and up will go the price. So the owner of the house will get the benefit, not the first home buyer. And so if we want to fix that, then as I said, we've either got to increase supply, or you've got to reduce the number of people at the auction. You've got to reduce the number of investors. And that'll occur through, the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing are worth just over $20 billion a year. To put that in context, that's about the size of the stage 3 tax cuts. We're talking about enormous amounts. To put it even more into context, the Labor government, through their housing fund, are proposing to spend $500 million a year on housing. So 40 times that is what we're spending on these tax concessions. They're enormous, and unfortunately they're making housing less affordable. If we were to cut back on those, not only would housing become more affordable, but we would also have billions and billions of dollars to put into building more social and affordable housing. And not just social and affordable housing, we could also put that into building community infrastructure. So rather than just building the housing, waiting for transport links and hospitals and schools to get overflowing, you could get in ahead of the curve and use that money to build those transport links and community infrastructure ahead of time.
Yeah, so young people, I think, come out of their education and they face a really long period of renting, renting in a sector that's pretty unregulated. It actually hasn't always been. We used to have some rent controls in Australia that were wound back in the 70s, which is interesting. The history of housing in Australia is actually a history of things that were once done well and are now done badly, which is quite depressing. But they're renting in a sector where they can face like a 10, 15, 20% rent increase. They can't really plan to save. And then when they are eventually ready to buy, when they've managed to scrape together a deposit, maybe with the help of their parents, they're entering a market that's really overheated for all of the reasons that Matt just described. So I think part of the picture really is making renting something that's a bit more stable and predictable for people so that they can plan to save. That is a really big generational difference that our parents had. Generations of people have always rented in Australia, but it used to be a lot more temporary, and one of the reasons it was more temporary is because it was a bit more predictable. People could just plan their life around, all right, I'll rent for the next 10 years, I'll save this much, I'll be able to have a level of predictability that I'll be able to save this much and buy when I'm ready to. So if we want to recreate that, we do need to think about how we put some parameters around renting to make it a bit more a bit more stable, a bit more predictable and a bit more regulated. We are a global outlier in Australia with completely unregulated and unlimited rent increases. So that does need to change, and it's something that people would benefit from pretty quickly. One of the few changes governments could make that people would benefit from fairly immediately. And then I do think that we need to have the tax reform conversation to make buying a bit more affordable. Right now, we spend billions of dollars lining the pockets of investors to go out and push up the price, push up the cost of housing, and then we look around and say, why is it so expensive when we're putting all of this money over here to push up these costs? I don't think that's the fault of the individual investors, by the way. I don't think individuals have done anything wrong. Individuals didn't create this system. Individuals are just responding to incentives that have been created by government.
And I guess in following that, Matt, maybe we can just delve in a little bit more to make sure, to understand that a vast majority of investors are investors of, for example, one property. The family home that benefits from capital gains exemption, and then you have investment properties. The numbers the scaremongering around having the conversation for all of these levers being on the table is the coming after the family home. That is not what we're talking about. We are talking about the investment scene, but also the more than one property. It's where it's become excessive, I guess, because there's no limit or caps to the current concessions. So I think it is important to talk about the current status when it comes to the capital gains deduction from an investment property point of view, and looking at it as an investment strategy.
Yeah, so let's just go back one tiny step. I'm an economist and tax fascinates me. Apparently everybody else is not like that. I find out when I talk about it at parties. But the capital gains tax discount basically means that if you buy an asset and you sell it for more than you bought it for, you've made a capital gain. So let's say you bought a property and you sold it sometime later, over a year later, for $200,000 more. So you've made a $200,000 capital gain. What the discount says is basically the ATO says, let's pretend that you didn't make a $200,000 capital gain, you only made a $100,000 capital gain. And that other $100,000, that's yours. We won't tax that at all. We'll just tax half the capital gain. So that's why it's called a 50% discount. And we don't discount any other form of income. So if you go out and work, okay, and inflation and time increases your wages, every now and then, politicians give us a tax cut, but that's not discounted automatically like capital gains. If you get money from interest, if you get money from dividends, if you run a business and have profit, none of this is discounted. Capital gains is the only kind of income that is discounted. And from an economics point of view, that's really weird because economists see a lot more value in people going out and work, because they produce something, right? There's output. If you go out and run a business and earn a profit, that's producing something. All of these forms of income create stuff. A capital gain is just buying an asset, it goes up in price, and then you sell it. There's no additional adding to the economy. So economists think you should probably tax that kind of income more, not less, but at the moment we tax it at half the rate. We give a 50% discount on it. So it's quite strange from an economics perspective.
I know, for example, today there's conversation that's starting to evolve around should it be just fair and it be taxed in the same way as other investments, so that all investments, I guess, become equal. But then keeping in mind we need to make sure this doesn't decrease availability of private capital into the supply chain and the construction. So all of these things need to be modelled. Always a lot of conversation around negative gearing. So again, between all of these levers, there are other jurisdictions that have done it well, where there are caps or there are scales that the benefits aren't maybe available at sort of the level of one investment property, but as you get to 2, 3 or more, those things change. Are these some of the models that we should be looking at in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, let's take a step back and not assume that everybody knows what negative gearing is. Negative gearing is basically if you own an investment property, all the expenses, including the interest you pay on the mortgage for that investment property, if they are greater than the amount of rent that you take in, then you're making a loss on that property. And you can take that loss and offset it against your wages, for example. And so that basically you can write that loss off and reduce the amount of tax you pay. And that's basically negative gearing. Now you might think, well, being negatively geared is not a winning strategy, right? Like, you're still making a loss. Sure, the taxpayer is picking up part of that loss, but you still have to foot that bill. So what's the benefit? Why would you be negatively geared? Well, the benefit is when you sell the property for more than you bought it for. So the benefit is the capital gain at the end. So negative gearing has been around since 1936. The Lyons Labor government, if everybody remembers it, back in the 30s, they introduced it. And we didn't have this problem for, decades and decades. It wasn't until the capital gains tax discount came along. Why? Because it made it really tax effective, to use an economic term, to earn money through capital gains, because you get a 50% discount on that. And so people could pay a lot more for a house and make a bigger bigger loss, that is, have a bigger negative, be bigger negatively geared. They could do that because they would get more back they would keep more, of the capital gain because they would pay a lot less tax on it. And so, to be honest, negative gearing is tiny compared to the capital gains tax discount. I said they were worth just over $20 billion together. Negative gearing is $2.5 billion of that. The capital gains tax discount is $20 billion of that, right? And honestly, if you could only get rid of one, if you got rid of the capital gains tax discount, negative gearing wouldn't be a problem anymore. It wasn't a problem before, and it won't be a problem probably afterwards, because people don't want to be negatively geared if they can't make that profit at the end by keeping all of the capital gain.
Okay, so that's obviously a piece that's missing in the conversation in the media. Maiy?
I managed to turn off my microphone, I think. There's a couple of aspects to the tax conversation that I think are also underappreciated. I think one is the impact that this tax regime that we have has on renters. So back in the 80s and 90s, most private landlords in Australia were positively geared, which meant that they were profit making. They owned their investment property outright and they were making money from rent. And back then you saw much more modest rent increases. What we've done as we've incentivised a whole lot of loss-making landlords into the rental market is they're a lot more sensitive to the market. I mean, they're loss making for all the reasons Matt explained. And one of the things that we've seen is not just that house prices have gone up, but also that we've started to see rent increases annually in the order of 10, 15, 20%, which we never used to see. We used to see much more modest rent increases. The other thing that we've seen, and I think this is something that I find confusing, that it's not linked to the tax system more, the short stay phenomenon, the Airbnb issue. You see state governments really try to tackle it with things like vacancy taxes, and that's great, I support those things, but they're never going to be as effective as doing something about negative gearing and capital gains, because right now you can claim these deductions if the home is just advertised on one of these short stay rental sites, but you can make much bigger profits. And you can also claim greater deductions, so you can claim deductions for things like artwork, cleaning, all sorts of stuff. And while that's there, a vacancy tax is never going to be as great a disincentive as the tax system is an incentive. That might have been a word salad. I don't know if it made sense. But yeah.
No, and I should say, and I know I can see Tim here, and I know he's raised this issue with state government and also around when, for example, a property is on the market for rent, for example, Airbnb, that there should be more accountability of whether those properties are generally available for rent, because what we are seeing is that shortage of supply, and that can't be there can't be a deduction in relation to those properties if they are not genuinely available for rent, if they are actually in fact being used for personal use. And what we have seen with the growth of the Airbnb and the stays kind of model is there is a lot more ability to mask whether or not a property is genuinely available for rent and that short stay versus genuinely available or being used for private use. Now, I'm conscious of time, and we've got more questions that came through from all of you. In particular, the question around foreign ownership and immigration. So there is a lot of, I would argue, knee-jerk reaction that blaming immigration for our housing crisis. But at the same time, we have the situation where we have huge skill shortages and demand in many areas, especially ironically, the very construction industry we need to be booming to create the supply. Matt, can you give us a little bit of more of a sense of the analysis of, how much is immigration genuinely part of the problem? Obviously, we need, the equation must make sense, and we have to have infrastructure and investment in housing to match any sort of growth of population. But we do know our population is growing, and it's a key part of our economic growth for us as a country. And so I've already had the debate in Parliament around international students, for example, being blamed for housing supply when they more often than not are actually in special accommodation that is specific for students. And then the question around immigration.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's look at what the statistics tell us. So over the last 10 years, the population has increased by 15%. Over that same time period, the supply of dwellings, the number of dwellings, new dwellings that have been built, has increased by 19%. So supply has gone ahead of demand. That is, it's 4% higher over the last 10 years. So it's not supply necessarily that is causing this problem. We're building at the moment, or we have over the last 10 years on average, more homes than the population has gone up by. Now, there are other factors in there. So, you know, the average number of people in each house is going down over time. So that I'm not saying that supply is not a factor. It absolutely is a factor. The other thing on the immigration area is we had this great natural experiment, though I don't know whether we should call it great, when we had COVID and we closed the borders, right? So we shut the borders down and immigration went to zero. Okay? Now, if immigration was the driving force of house prices, when we shut those borders for about 18 months, house prices should have gone flat or gone down, right? If immigration is what's driving it. House prices soared during that period, right? Why did they soar? Well, they soared because interest rates went down. Everybody had, when they went to the bank to decide that they wanted to buy a property, the bank manager told them you can buy more, and they all showed up to the auction knowing that they could borrow more. Okay, and that's why house prices went up. But that highlights that immigration, while it is a factor, I'm not saying it's not a factor, it is not a large factor and it is not the driving factor. And if you got rid of immigration completely, as we did during COVID, you would still have house price increases.
And then foreign ownership. So we have got rules in place around foreign ownership, and we have got often a lot of feedback around vacancy in our communities. And there is talk around vacancy levies, for example. But it's very difficult for local government areas to even track that. I mean, I understand it through water usage and other things like that. But can you give us a sense? So many questions came in around that point of should there be greater restrictions around foreign ownership? And then that question of especially where they are then left vacant or vacancy issues.
I'll do the foreign ownership if you like, and then you can look at I know you're good on the vacancy stuff. Foreigners don't vote. And that means that we have lots of restrictions on foreigners buying houses, right? Governments are quite happy to restrict foreign ownership because there is almost no political backlash. And so we actually do have a lot of foreign restrictions, and we don't see very much foreigners buying houses in Australia. And the reason is because it's actually really, really hard to buy a house in Australia as a foreigner. Well,
to add to that, actually, foreign investment is extremely targeted at new supply and kind of quite high-end new supply. I think that's not very well understood, but there's really not a lot of foreign investment in Australia. I think if there's something we need to look at, it's probably domestic investment, which is a lot trickier, and we've gone over a little bit. I don't have a ton to add on the vacancy stuff beyond what I said about tax. I really do think the tax system that we have is the big driver of the short stay rental sector that we've got at the moment. But I do think that the impact on communities that have a large number of these short stay rentals, I imagine, this is a beautiful place, and I imagine you have some short stay rentals as a result of that. But I've spoken at forums and events in places like Hobart where people don't even have neighbours. They just have like people who check into the house next door with a trundle bag every few days, and it's really bad for community connection. It creates a lot of community dislocation when people aren't just living in their houses and getting to have neighbours in the way that they've experienced and been used to. I think the vacancy taxes are great and they're a good step, but until we see some restrictions. I also think if you were to limit negative gearing on the short stays, I think it would be pretty popular. I actually don't think it would be widely opposed. I think that's something that the government could do pretty quickly and pretty easily, actually.
Okay. Well, look, I mean, I should also say from a data point of view, our electorate, Warringah, we are slightly higher than the national average when it comes to properties negatively geared in our area. So that is part of the conversation for everyone to understand the why, the need, and what are the different levers that might need to be taken, put on the table. So I've addressed pretty much most of the sections of questions that have been put. There is still the issue, of course, of the interrelation between the mid-density and the targets, and then what does that do for infrastructure and transport on the beaches? Obviously, we now with Warringah having a different sort of very different segments from North Sydney. There will be a rail line in Warringah through North Sydney, transport is often an issue, an objection that is raised with me from the community, that concern of the impact on our public services, the buses. How does that equate? So, Louise, maybe if I can come back to you, we were talking a little bit about before, there are some really key projects that could actually unlock and make a huge difference. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
We know that we need good transport infrastructure and other community infrastructure on the Northern Beaches. A really good example of some forward planning that we've embarked on is the Brookvale Structure Plan. We know through our structure plan, which has been endorsed by Council, that we've got a capacity at present for 1,350 new dwellings. We know that we can unlock the capacity in that precinct if significant state infrastructure is delivered. And an example of that is the grade separation at Warringah Road and Pittwater Road. Likewise, with the Frenchs Forest precinct, we have a new town centre that we're waiting to come online if the state government were to sell the land. And we know that capacity could grow in double from the 2,000 to about 4,000 if infrastructure that we would consider to be city shaping, such as the Beaches Link, is brought into fruition. So they're just some of the projects within the Northern Beaches where we know we've got capacity, but we need the infrastructure to be able to support the additional growth and population.
Yeah. So, for example, one area that everyone may not be aware of is that the project, it is on the federally the Infrastructure Australia priority list. It is the grade separation at Brookvale. Think Office Works there. And I know Michael has done a lot of work on this as well. And we are pushing from state and federal point of view for these to remain on the priority list and to be progressed. But maybe, Michael, you could touch on that a little bit. No.
You kind of said that. It was just we need, as a council, we got that on the priority list, the grade separation. It means you can do, as Zali said, as Louise said, you can increase the capacity in Brookvale by another 2,000 dwellings, which is significant. With our zoning controls as well for affordable, we can do all that. So we've costed that around $500 million, but that's only an increase of about another 2,000 dwellings, which is not huge, but it's not insignificant either. The Frenchs Forest High School site is the one that we're all focused on because that's 1,000 dwellings on that one high school site. So when the high school opens next year in June at Allambie, that frees up that site, and it's only a DA away. It doesn't have to be rezoned. It's a DA away, and there's 1,000 units plus retail plus commercial on that one site plus open space. And that's what we're working with the Treasurer, with Minister Jackson and the Premier to try and get something that is going to be 1,000 units of affordable, not just 15%. And that's what we're really trying to come up with a new novel approach and project to.
Thank you. So, look, I know we've got a long time. I've tried to address a lot of the issues that were raised with me, but we do have some roving mics. So if we can make some quick fire questions. I know you've probably got lots of burning issues, but we'll try and get to a few questions from the floor if they weren't able to be put through at the registration process. Just try and keep them short. The shorter they are, the more questions we can get to. Who's got the mics? Oh, anyone? Any burning topics?
Hi, my 25 years with Street Mission.
It's on.
My 25 years with Street Mission and 6 years on the Housing Appeals Committee have brought me into contact with some very desperate people in our community. I think that housing should be a basic human right. I think that that we should make it a human right. Government should be aware and should have quotas to deliver these human rights and be accountable if they don't.
I'll take that as a statement. Was there any other questions? Yes.
Well, I'll probably address this one specifically to Maiy. What effect has Airbnb had on the supply?
I view Airbnb as a symptom of the problems that we're having rather than a cause. So it's a symptom of the unfair distribution of housing that we've got in Australia and the inequality that we've got in Australia with regard to housing supply. One of the things Matt talked about is that supply has outpaced demand recently. That's not just over the last 10 years, that's a long-term trend. We've actually never had more homes per person in Australia than we do today, and local governments for years have, and I don't need to tell these this 2 rows in front of me, have been moving to densify for actually a long time. So this is part of a long-term trend. So what we've got is housing in Australia that's extremely inequitably distributed. Household size changes are also not uniform. Wealthier households are getting smaller. Low and middle income households are staying the same size or getting bigger. So I think for me, the Airbnb issue is just a symptom of the inequities that we have, a symptom of the unfair tax system that we have.
So on that issue of household, sort of smaller households within larger homes, there is nothing in the system that incentivises downsizing. So currently, stamp duty is essentially a penalty for anyone considering downsizing. And for example, an owner who would like to rent out some rooms or rent out a granny flat loses the capital gains exemption on the primary residence by earning an income. So the irony is, in terms of trying to create better utilisation of current stock, the system disincentivises it. So maybe, Matt, you can talk about from a taxation point of view, and the lever for stamp duty is ultimately a state government one, with the assistance of federal, I know, for lost revenue. Well, but stamp duty is a state tax. But
yeah, I'm not going to step in the middle of these two. Look, the tax system does not do a good job of encouraging people to downsize. Zali's absolutely correct, and that's across the state and federal level. In the ACT, we're basically on this long trip where we're getting rid of stamp duty on housing and converting it into rates at a $1 for $1 rate. So we're basically trying to stop stamp duty, which is a penalty for moving, and instead just collect the same amount of money from rates. And that would certainly help solve part of that problem. Unfortunately, it's not really popular because people's rates keep going up, and they don't think about the fact that they won't have to pay stamp duty when they sell their house. All they think about is what their rates notice is, year to year. So absolutely, there is more we can do around taxation, but also, there are incentives that we could have around the capital. So your primary residence is absolutely exempt from capital gains. You don't get a discount; you get 100% discount, right? Like, you don't pay any capital gain on your primary residence. And as Zali was saying, but if you rent it out, if you've got a spare room and you want to rent it out, then you can actually jeopardise that exemption on your home. And so that's definitely another place we could look at of modifying that in order to encourage people to take in more people and reverse this kind of trend to smaller and smaller house sizes.
Yeah, and especially if one went back to the concept of borders, for example, or taking in students, and also maybe from a DA and an approval process, looking at facilitating construction of granny flats it increases supply without getting to mid-rise density. Is that something? Oh, okay, Michael's got a view on that. I'll go Louise first.
Look, that's already available in the planning system. So we've seen, particularly in the former Warringah LGA area, a significant increase in the number of granny flats. We are actually trying to incentivise that more broadly across the Northern Beaches with our new LEP by allowing people to have greater than the 60 square metres that they currently have now if it's attached to a dwelling. We're also seeking to change, I suppose, the mix of dwelling types, so allowing dual occupancies along most of the local government area now, whereas it's currently restricted in the former Warringah area. So there are those incentives already through state planning controls as well.
Planning point of view it is. I just have to go to bat for the federal taxation changes. Okay, Michael, you were going to add?
I was just going to really quickly add, but just to illustrate the example of what Louise said then, was we had over 3,500 granny flats put in exempt development in people's backyards in Warringah in a few small years. You heard a figure earlier, 8,000 people need social or affordable crisis housing almost. Now, if you get a picture, if we were given, let's just cap that, 3,000, let's say 3,000 of those. If I could go to a Bridge Housing or I could go to a Anglicare or something like that as a housing provider and say, if the government gives me that tax-free, $500, tax-free, cap it, and they manage it on my behalf, and it goes to any of those community providers, whether it's women fleeing domestic violence, whether it's they're transitioning out, whether it's the over 55s mob, there's 3,000 immediately available. All we need is the tax incentives, and I don't think we've done it. I think we need to get together on this one with the state to help push this. I think it's a really simple and easy one. And why shouldn't you have tax-free income? What's wrong with having $500 and helping someone at the same time? I think it's a no-brainer. And we've got the actual properties here now, over 3,500 already in the system, which we could easily adapt. And I'd take $500 a week cash free,
Not
tax-free.
even just the tax-free aspect of that. It's also not losing the capital gains exemption of the family home, I think is the bigger long-term concern of making those things available. Please.
Sue Weatherly, and I'm the president of the Planning Institute of Australia. And the question I have for the panel is the issue of inclusionary zoning. In 2016, the state government draft metropolitan strategy recommended that all upzoned areas should provide between 5 and 10% of affordable rental housing. That did not make the final cut. And since then, it's been this ad hoc system of what can council negotiate via voluntary planning agreements, its own affordable housing policies. For example, at the moment, out of the 35 metropolitan councils, there's only 7 affordable housing policies. And we've seen a really underplay of the need for affordable housing in the current housing reforms of the state government. So how important would it be, or is it a better system that the state government really ramp up the requirements for inclusionary zoning in terms of affordable rental housing in new developments in New South Wales?
Yes.
So the panel.
Yeah. I mean, yes, that would be fantastic and important. I believe that the only, I could be wrong, I'm nervous about so many local government people here who could correct me. I believe the only mandatory inclusionary zoning target in New South Wales is currently in the city of Sydney, and that it's 1%, which is pretty atrocious. If you look at countries like, cities, Paris and London that are moving to make, really build up social housing, they've got mandatory inclusionary zoning targets of like 40 to 50%. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be looking at if we're really serious about driving affordability. I think one of the problems that we've got at the moment is that it's become a really convenient political narrative for not just the state government, but I find especially the federal government to engaging this debate as though the only thing that needs to happen is to boost private supply. Boosting private supply is really important. I don't need to. We've covered why it's important, but it's not sufficient on its own. And it's been really interesting for me in the past couple of years to meet with people from this Labor government who I met with. The exact same people when they were in opposition just 5 or 6 years ago. At that time, they all believed that the most important levers were with the federal government, and today they all believe that the most important levers are with local government. And I really think that that's just political opportunism. It's really easy. It's a really easy story to just say, we have a target of the private sector going off and building 1.2 million homes, and if they don't achieve it, we're just going to blame other levels of government. That's their strategy at the moment, and it's really convenient for them, and I think it's important to push back.
I'm sensing my question for when I'm in Parliament next. Well, I've probably got time for one more question. The gentleman in the middle. So I'll try and get a couple more. But so the gentleman's been waiting, so I think...
First of all, a comment. The population of Australia grew by 400,000 last year. Northern Beaches has about 1% of the population. We should be absorbing 4,000 people per annum for the next 20 years, not 4,000 over 10 years, 4,000 over 1 year. Next, as a retired architect developer, why would I consider building any significant housing development in Northern Beaches? I can go to other council areas in Sydney, Parramatta, Blacktown, and get all sorts of incentives and help and not spend 3 or 4 years waiting for an approval like I would in Northern Beaches. So I wouldn't develop on the Northern Beaches.
So how do we overcome that? Because we do still need to develop on the Northern Beaches as well.
You're in competition with all the other areas. You're not winning, you're losing. Okay. We lost population last year. The population went down in the Northern Beaches, not up.
Well, and which has changed boundaries. But maybe, just, Louise, you can address
maybe in
them.
relation, just I'll answer the question in relation to the performance of the DA area. The Northern Beaches Council is one of the highest performing councils when it comes to DA processing times. The state government, as part of the new housing targets, publishes a league table, and we process one of the highest number of development applications across Sydney, and our average processing days is about 75 days. So there's always going to be an outlier where there are complex assessment issues, and the example of the 3-year approval might be a slight embellishment. But some significant issues were borne out in that application. But on the whole, we are doing our bit to ensure that at least we are dealing with DAs in a really timely manner.
So the obstacle in terms of that competition with other areas, is it price? Is it what's approved? Is it community pushback? Public transport?
It's a collection of things, and I think it's kind of goes back to the beginning of why is there, a shortage of supply. We do have plans. We've got land that is zoned to enable housing, and we are receiving development applications. As an example, it is the supply which is becoming a problem. Over the last 5 years, we've processed development applications which are adding supply of about 860 per annum, yet only 300 are being completed on an annual basis. So that is an inherent issue. We are doing our bit when the applications are being lodged, but it's over to the market to then deliver the housing on the ground. And there's a number of issues that obviously prevent that from occurring.
And I should say it's a whole other discussion that we don't have time for tonight, but the question around fit for purpose housing, adapted for that it be climate resilient. We need to be cognizant of that, especially our area, the Northern Beaches, identified as an area at high risk. And so making sure that we have building that is energy efficient and climate resilient is going to be, but that's a whole nother conversation that we won't have time for. There's a question down the back, and I want to make sure we've sort of gone across the room. So if we could get maybe the two ladies at the back, and then I'm conscious of being out of time, but...
So it's probably one of the younger people in the room looking around and one of the only renters who's recently had to move. I think I saw someone down there as well. My husband, he's a teacher at a local school here. We cannot afford to live here. Yet I have a great job and he has a great job as a teacher. Within our network of friends in the last 3 weeks, 4 young families have decided to move out of the Northern Beaches, and every single one of those families, 2 of them are teachers, once again, Northern Beaches. One is a social worker at the Northern Beaches Hospital. We know mental health is a massive issue. And the other is a builder, contributing to our community. This is a massive issue. The dual occupancy stuff, when I saw that council was finally doing something around that, I was so excited. I literally sent it to all my friends, said, finally, we might have an option. But then the minimum lot size that you require to build a dual occupancy under new housing controls is 800 square metres with a minimum frontage of 18 metres, when the average lot size in the existing area was 600. You will find no new dual occupancies built because the controls do not allow it to work. when we have a median house price of $2 million and the average cost to build a home is probably $800,000, you're still looking at $1.2 million. So if we halve that area, you're still looking at over, $1.2 to $1.5 million, even for a dual occupancy. Our minimum lot sizes are too small. Our problem with housing is not the cost of housing. The cost of housing is relatively stagnant, even though we've had a bit of an increase in the last few years post-COVID. The cost in relation to housing affordability issue is the cost of land. We need to use our land more efficiently because the land on the Northern Beaches isn't getting larger.
I think maybe, Matt, you can also address that question of affordability, though. Getting into the housing market, it was traditionally about 4 times the annual income to afford to get into the housing market. It's now, on average, about 10 times. So that has a huge impact, and then we can maybe talk about that dual occupancy question.
Housing has become massively less affordable. We are giving tens of billions of dollars in tax concessions to encourage house prices to go up, and we need billions and billions of dollars to encourage supply. If only there was a solution that matched up and we were able to solve both those problems. It's not complicated.
Anyone else from the panel? Contribution?
Oh, I would just welcome your feedback on our draft LEP when we go out on an exhibition.
Okay. Sorry. Oh, the Planning Institute. Sorry. We'll get to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Zali, and thanks to the panel. I've got a question about, let's say there's a lot of talk about taking a bit of the heat out of the investment market for housing. But let's say governments aren't quite ready to make the changes that we've talked about tonight. Is there a way of leveraging the existing taxation regime to get some better results in terms of the quality, the sustainability, and the social offering from our housing stock? Let's say if you do receive a taxation advantage from the combination of negative gearing and capital gains discounts, can you have an obligation put on you to provide better performing stock, more affordable stock, more environmentally sound stock? Is there some way we can leverage the existing system if we can't make the changes that have been talked about, or at least as a halfway house?
Matt, what are your thoughts as an economist?
Yeah, absolutely. We could do that. We could put restrictions on both those tax concessions so that people had to meet other requirements like providing affordable housing or doing things in other ways. That's absolutely. It seems like a far more complicated fix than just sort of cutting back on those concessions. But yes, absolutely, that is possible. If you want to really dig down into nerdiness, and I'm not going to go into it, but there are all other kinds of policies that you can use about financing. You can restrict the amount of mortgages that banks can lend to investors and have them preference first home or home buyers. There are all kinds of different strategies that we could do if we didn't want to. We're kind of trying to edge our way around kind of the elephant in the room, and I can understand why for political reasons that's happening. It's just frustrating, I suppose, from an economist's point of view when the solution is sort of staring you in the face.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It'd be great to get some better environmental results and social.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
That exist in the tax system.
Well, definitely something to take on board. We will have some further conversations around how the current system, whether we can encourage greater courage. And I think, again, nights like tonight are incredibly important so that we can really establish the why, the need, the demand, why it matters to all of you. Even though the vast majority of people here in the room own their home, I think you're here, I hope, with a concern because of predicted density changes, what that means, but what the upside to the community is, what that means in terms of essential workers being able to be here. But then I know there is that concern around transport. So I know I'm out of time. We're approaching Te Pasa. Is there any, I guess, I think I'm seeing nodded heads and people probably want to go home and have dinner. But if I could thank the panel for your incredible contribution and everyone for being here tonight. I know many of you might have more burning questions. Please send them through. We will do our best to get more information to you to explore these questions. If there's a burning desire, we can try and host another forum and really get to more engaged, really solutions-based. I will get back to everyone with a recording of the night and also a short survey where I'd really appreciate your feedback on all the different levers and issues that were discussed, which you feel really should be prioritised, because ultimately I am in Parliament on behalf of the community and I need to reflect your wishes and concerns. So I really appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.